You need to stop saying this is the problem, we'll find a solution, to saying how do I build capability that can solve problems we haven't yet anticipated. And I think that's part of the problem in education.
Hello and welcome to the Agile Innovation Leaders podcast. I'm Ola Ojako. On this podcast, I speak with world-class leaders and doers about themselves and a variety of topics spanning agile, lean innovation, business, leadership, and much more, with actionable takeaways for you, the listener. Dave, thank you for making the time for this conversation. I read in your latest book, the book Cynefin, Weaving Sense Making into the Fabric of Our World, which was released, I believe, in celebration of the 21st year of the framework. And you mentioned that in your childhood, you had a multidisciplinary upbringing, and which involved lots of reading. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it wasn't uncommon in those days. I mean, if you did, I did science A-levels and mathematical A-levels. But the assumption was you would read every novel that the academic English class were reading. In fact, it was just unimaginable that you wouldn't know that and you wouldn't know the basics of history. So if you couldn't survive that in the sixth form common room, and the basics of science were known by most of the arts people as well. So that was common, right? And we had to debate every week at any rate. So every week you went up to the front of the class and you were given a card. And it had a subject in which side you were on, and you had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation. And we did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. And that was a wonderful discipline because it meant you read everything. Yeah. But also, my mother, both my parents were the first from working class communities to go to university. And they got there by scholarship or sheer hard work, against the opposition of their families. My mother went to university in Germany just after the war, which is extremely brave of her, as a South Wales working class girl. So you weren't allowed not to be educated. It was considered the unforgivable sin.
Wow. Did it mean that she had to learn German because studying in Germany?
She got A-levels in languages, so she went to university to study German, and she actually ended up as a German teacher, German and French. So she had that sort of background. Yeah.
And was that what influenced you? Because you also mentioned in the book that you won a £60 prize.
Oh no, that was just fun. So Mum was very politically active. We're a South Wales Labour. Well, I know Plaid Cymru, but we were Labour. And so she was a local councillor. She was always politically active. There's a picture of me on Bertrand Russell's knee as a baby on a CND march. So it was that sort of background. And she was campaigning for comprehensive education and had a ferocious fight with Hayden Williams, I think, who was the director of education. It was really nasty. I mean, I got threatened on my 11 plus. It got really nasty.
Wow.
And then, so when in the sixth form, I won the prize in his memory. It caused endless amusement in the whole county. All right. I think I partly won it for that, but that was for contribution beyond academic. Yeah. So I was leading a lot of stuff in the community and stuff like that. But that form, because I had £60 and the assumption was you go and buy one massive book. And I didn't. I got Dad to drive me to Liverpool, went into the big bookshop there and just came out with, books were 2 and 6pence then. So you can imagine how many books I could get for £60. And I just took everything I could find on philosophy and history and introductory science and stuff like that and just consumed it.
Wow. It seemed like you already knew what you wanted even before winning the prize money. You seem to have had a wish list. Because
I think it's interesting. One of the big things in the EU field guide on complexity, which we've just issued, is you need to build, you need to stop saying this is the problem, we'll find a solution, to saying how do I build capability that can solve problems we haven't yet anticipated. And I think that's part of the problem in education, because my children didn't have that benefit. They had a modular education. We did a set of exams at 16 and a set of exams at 18. And between those periods, we could explore it. And we had to hold everything in our minds for those 2 periods. Whereas my children, it was do a module, pass a test, get a mark, move on, forget it, move on. So it's this very compartmentalized. Yeah. And it's also quite instrumentalist. I think we were given an education as much in how to learn and how to find things out. And the debating tradition was that, yeah, is you didn't know what you're going to get hit with, so you read everything and you thought about it and you learned to think on your feet. And I think that sort of, it's a broad switch. It started to happen in the 80s, along with a lot of other bad things in management. And this is when systems thinking started to dominate, and we moved to an engineering metaphor. And you can see it in cybernetics and everything else. It's an attempt to define everything as a machine. And of course, machines are designed for a purpose, whereas ecosystems evolve for resilience. And I think that's kind of like where my generation were. And it's certainly what we're trying to bring back in now in terms of practice. Yeah.
I have an engineering background and a computer science background. These days, I'm developing a newfound love for philosophy, psychology, law, intersect. How do all these concepts intersect? Because as human beings, we're complex. We're not machines where you put a program in and you expect it to come out the same. It's not going to be the same for every human being. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think, we know more on this as well. So we know the role of art in human evolution as being closely linked to innovation. So art comes before language. So abstraction allows you to make novel connections. So if you focus entirely on STEM education, you're damaging the human capacity to innovate. And we're, as creatures, we're curious. Yeah. And I mean, we got this whole concept of aporia, which is key to Cynefin now, which is creating a state of deliberate confusion, or a state of paradox. And the essence of a paradox is you can't resolve it, so you're forced to think differently. So the famous case on this is the liar's paradox. All right. I mean, I always lie. Well, that just means I lied. So if that means I was telling the truth, so you've got to think differently about the problem. I mean, Zeno's paradoxes do the same thing. So that deliberate act of creating confusion so people can see novelty is key. Yeah. And if you don't, and finding ways to do that. So when we looked at it, we looked at linguistic aporia, aesthetic aporia, and physical aporia. So I got one of the defining moments of insight on Cynefin was looking at Caravaggio's paintings in Naples, when I realized I'd been looking for the idea of liminality. And then it all came together, right? So those sort of trigger points require a more composite way of learning. I think it's also multiculturalism, to be honest. I mean, when I left university, I worked on the World Council of Churches program to combat racism.
I'd like to know more about that. That's one of my questions.
Well, my mother was a good atheist, but she made me read the Bible on the basis I wouldn't understand European literature otherwise. And the punishment she got is I became a Catholic. So, no, I mean, that was fascinating because I worked on Aboriginal land rights in Northern Australia, for example. And that was when I saw an activist was literally murdered in front of me by a security guard. And we went to the police and they said, it's only an Abo. And I still remember having fights in Geneva because South Africa was a tribal conflict with a racial overlay. I mean, Afrikaners, Matabele and Zulu arrived in South Africa together and wiped out the native population. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand the Matabele betrayal, you don't understand what happened. It doesn't justify apartheid. I think one of the reasons there was a partial reconciliation is it actually was a tribal conflict and the ritual actually managed that. Whereas in Australia, in comparison, it was actually genocide. Yeah, it wasn't prejudice, it was genocide. I mean, until 1970s, they were still taking half-breed children forcibly away from their parents and intermarrying them in homes to breed them back to white. And I think, I had a big argument. I argued this in the UK. I said one of the things we should actually have is bring back national service. I couldn't get the Labour Party to adopt it. I said, because it would undermine the Conservatives because they're the ones who talk about that sort of stuff. But we should allow it to be overseas. So if you put 2 years into working in communities which are poorer than yours, round about that 18 to 21-year-old bracket, then we'll pay for your education. If you don't, you'll pay fees because you proved you want to give to society. And that would have been, I think, it would have meant we'd have had a generation of graduates who understood the world because that was part of the objective. I mean, I did that. I worked in South Africa on the banks of the Zimbabwe on the audits of the refugee camps around that fight, and in Sao Paulo in the slums, some of the worker priests. you can't come back from that and not be changed. And I think it's that key formative period we need to give people.
True. And like you said, at that age, when you're young and impressionable, it helps with broadening your worldview to know that the world is bigger than your father's
and it's an even worse problem in Agile, because what you've got a whole class of mainly white males, and misogynism in Agile is really bad. It's one of the worst areas for misogynism still left, right, in terms of the way it works.
I'm happy you're the one saying it, not me.
Well, no, I mean, it is. I mean, it's quite appalling. So what you've actually got is largely a bunch of white male game players who spent their entire time on computers, who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty. And that's kind of like a dominant culture. And that's actually quite dangerous, because it lacks cultural diversity, it lacks ethnic diversity, it lacks educational diversity. And I wrote an article for ITEL recently, which has been published, which said no engineer should be allowed out without a training in ethics, because the implications of what software engineers do now are huge. And the problem we've got, and this is a really significant, it's the big data problem as well. And you see it with the behavioral economists and the nudge theory guys, all of whom about these large scale data manipulation, is that they're amoral. They're not immoral, they're amoral. And that's actually always more scary. It's this sort of deep level instrumentalism about the numbers are telling me what I need to say.
And also, I mean, just building on what you've said, there are instances, for example, in artificial intelligence is really based on a sample set from a select group, and it doesn't necessarily recognize things that are called outliers, other races.
Right, it's worse than that. I mean, I've worked in that in all my life. I remember back 25 years ago, John Poindexter and I were on a stage in a conference in Washington. I mean, this was sort of early days of our work on counterterrorism. And somebody asked about black box AI, and I said, nobody's talking about the training data sets. And I'd worked in AI from the early days, all right? And the training data sets matter. And nobody bothered. They just assumed, and you get people publishing books which say correlation is causation, which is deeply worrying, right? And I think Google is starting to acknowledge that, but it's actually very late. And the biases, we were looking at a software tool the other day which said it can predict 85% of future events around culture. Well, it can only do that by constraining how executives see culture, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the recruitment algorithms will only recruit people who match that cultural expectation, and outliers will be eliminated. There's a HBO film coming up shortly on Myers-Briggs. Now, Myers-Briggs is known to be a pseudoscience. It has no basis whatsoever in any clinical work, and even Jung denied it, even though it's meant to be based on his work. But it's beautiful for HR departments because it allows them to put the people into little categories. Boxes. And critically, it abrogates judgment. And that's what happened with systems thinking in the 80s, 90s, is everything became spreadsheets and algorithms. So HR departments would produce, instead of managers making decisions based on judgment, HR departments would force them into profile curves to allocate resources. So actually, if you had a high-performing team, you were punished, because the assumption was teams would not have more than
bell curve
10% high performers in it, all right?
Yeah.
And this sort of nonsense has been running in the 80s, 90s, and it coincided. It was the three things came together. One was the popularization of systems thinking. And unfortunately, it got popularized around things like process re-engineering and learning organization. So that was the hard end. And Sengi's pious cant was sort of the soft end of it, all right? But both of them were highly directional. It was kind of like leaders decide, everything follows, yeah? And that coincided with the huge growth of computing, the ability to handle large volumes of information. And all of those sort of things came together in a sort of perfect storm, and we lost a lot of humanity in the process.
So do you think there's hope for us to regain the humanity in the process? Because it seems like the tide is turning from, there is still an emphasis, in my view, on systems thinking. However, there is the growing realization that we have, knowledge workers and people
coming to the end of its dark cycle.
Yes.
Right? You can see that, all right? I can see it with the amount of cybernetics fanboys, and they are all boys who jump on me every time I say something about complexity, all right? So I think they're feeling threatened. And the EU Field Guide is significant because it's a government kind of like publication around effectively taking an ecosystems approach, not a cybernetic approach, right? And there's a book published by a good friend of mine called Terry Eagleton, who's, I don't think he's written a bad book, and he's written about 30 or 40. I mean, the guy just produces his stuff. It's called Hope Without Optimism. And I think, hope is, I mean, Moltmann has just also published an update of his theology of hope, which is worth reading even if you're not religious. But hope is one of those key concepts, right? You should, to lose hope is a sin. But hope is not the same thing as optimism. In fact, pessimistic people who hope actually are probably the ones who'll make a difference because they're not naive, right? And this is my objection to the likes of Sharmaga and Sengi and the like, is they just gather people together to talk about how things should be. And of course, everything should be what, white MIT educated males think the world should be like. I mean, it's very culturally imperialist in that sort of sense. And then nobody changes because anybody can come together in a workshop and agree how things should be. It's when you make a difference in the field that it counts. You've got to create a micro difference. This is hyperlocalization. You've got to create lots and lots of micro differences, which will stimulate the system so the system will change. I think three things have come together. One is COVID, the other is global warming. The other is, and I prefer to call it the epistemic justice movement, although that kind of like fits in with Black Lives Matter. But epistemic justice doesn't just affect people who are female or are black. I mean, if you come to the UK and see the language about the Welsh and the Irish, or the jokes made about the Welsh in BBC, all right? The way we use language can designate people in different ways. And I think that's a big movement now. And it's certainly something we develop software for. So I think those three come together, and I think the old models aren't going to be sustainable. I mean, the cost is going to be terrible. I mean, the cost of COVID is already bad. And we're not going to, I mean, there's no such thing as long COVID, it's permanent COVID. And people need to start getting used to that. Yeah. And I think that's going to change things. So, for example, in the village I live in, Wiltshire, somebody's now opened an artisan bakery in their garage. And it's brilliant. And everybody's popping around there twice a week and just buying the bread and having a chat on the way, socially distanced with masks, of course. Yeah. And talking with people, that sort of thing is happening a lot. COVID has forced people into local areas and forced people into realize the vulnerability of supply chains. So you can see changes happening there. The whole Trump phenomenon, right? And the Boris phenomenon in the UK is ongoing. It's just as bad as the Trump phenomenon. It's the institutionalization of corruption at a high level, right? Those sort of things trigger change, right? Not without cost. Change never comes without cost, but it just needs enough. It needs local action, not international action. I think that's the key principle. In order for people to accept things like the Paris Accord on climate change, then they've got to be prepared to take sacrifice. And it's too distant a time at the moment. It has to become a local issue for the international initiatives to actually work. And we're seeing that now. I mean,
it sounds like, sorry to interrupt. So it sounds like what you're saying is, for the local action, for change to happen, it has to start with us as individuals.
The disposition, no, not with individuals.
Okay.
That's actually a very North American, Northern European way of thinking, right?
Okay.
The fundamental kind of like basic identity structure of humans is actually clans, not individuals.
Clans.
Yeah. Extended families, clans, it's an ambiguous word. We actually evolved for those. And you need it at that level because that's a high level of social interaction and social dependency. And it's like, for example, right, I'm dyslexic, right? Yeah, if I don't see, if the spelling checker doesn't pick up a spelling mistake, I won't see it. And I read a whole page at a time. I do not read it sentence by sentence. All right. And I can't understand why people haven't seen the connections I make because they're obvious, right? Equally, there's a high degree of partial autism in the Agile community because that goes with mathematical ability and thing. And this so-called educational deficiencies in the attempt to define an ideal individual a mistake because we evolved to have these differences.
Yes.
Yeah. And the differences understood at the right level of interaction can change things. So I think the unit is clan, right? Or extended family, or extended interdependence.
Extended into
So we're seeing that in the village. I mean, this is classic British atomistic. None of our relatives live anywhere near us. But the interdependency in the village is increasing with COVID, and therefore people are finding relationships and things they can do together. Now, once that builds to a critical mass, and it does actually happen exponentially, then bigger initiatives are possible. And this is some of the stuff we're hoping to do in the US shortly on post-election reconciliation, and the work we've been doing in Malmo on refugees and elsewhere in the world, right? Is you change the nature of localized interaction with national visibility so that you can measure the dispositional state of the system, and then you can nudge the system when it's ready to change, because then the energy cost of change is low. But that requires real-time feedback loops and distributed human sensor networks, which is a key issue in the field guide. And the key thing there, it comes back to your original question on AI, is the internet at the moment is an unbuffered feedback loop. Yeah, where you don't know the source of the data and you can't control the source of the data. And any network like that, I mean, this is just a priori science fact, all right, will always become perverted.
And what do you mean by the term a priori?
Oh, before the facts. You don't need to wait, but we don't need to wait for evidence. It's like in Agile. You can look at something like SAFE, which claims to scale Agile, and just look at it and you say it's a priori wrong, because that's not how you scale a complex system. Yeah, so it's wrong. All right, end of argument. Right, now let's talk about the detail. Right. So that's that's coming back. The hyperlocalization thing is absolutely key on that. Right.
Okay.
And it's the same is true, to be honest, in software development. A lot of our work now is to understand the unarticulated needs of users, and then shift technology in to actually meet those unarticulated needs. And that requires a complex approach to architecture, in which people and technology are objects with defined interactions around scaffolding structures, so that applications can emerge and are resilient, right? And that's actually how local communities evolve as well. So we've now got the theoretical constructs and a lot of the practical methods to actually, and I've got a series of blog posts which I've got to get back to writing called Rewilding Agile. Yeah. And rewilding isn't returning to the original state, it's restoring balance. So if you increase the number of human actors as your primary sources, and I mean human actors not as people sitting on computer screens who can be faked or mimicked, yeah, and entirely working on text, which is about 10% of what we know. Danger is it might become 80% of what we know, and then you need to panic. All right. So, by changing those interactions, increasing the human agency in the system, that's how you deal with fake news. It's not by writing better algorithms, because then it becomes a war with the guys faking the news, and you're always going to lose.
So would you consider yourself a person of faith?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, faith is like hope and charity. I mean, they're the great virtues, right?
Something that's...
I got into a lot in trouble in the 70s. I wrote an essay which said Catholicism, Marxism, and Hinduism were ontologically identical, should be combined, and were different from Protestantism and capitalism, which were also ontologically identical and could be confined.
Is this available in the public domain?
I doubt it. I think it actually got me onto a heresy trial at one point, but I would still say that.
That's amazing. Can we then move to the framework, the Cynefin framework? How did it evolve into what we know it as today?
I'll do a high-level summary, but I wrote it up at length in the book. I didn't know I was writing for the book. The book was a surprise that they put together for me. I thought I was just writing an extended blog post. It started when I was working in IBM. It originates from the work of Max Brasso, who was my mentor for years, who tragically died early. But he was looking at abstraction, codification, and diffusion. We did a fair amount of work together. I took two of those aspects and started to look at informal and formal communities in IBM and at innovation. And some of the early articles on Cynefin, certainly the early ones with the 5 domains, come from that period. And at that time, we had axis labels, yeah. And then complexity theory came into it. So it shifted into being a complexity framework. And it stayed that the 5 domains were fairly constant for a fairly long period of time. They changed their names a bit. The central domain I knew was important, but didn't have as much prominence as it does now. And then I introduced liminality, partly driven by Agile people, actually, because they couldn't get the concept. They were dynamics and domains. So you used to say things like, look, Scrum is a dynamic. It's a way of shifting complex to complicated. And people say, no, the Scrum guy said it's about complex. And you think, oh God, Stacey has a lot to answer for. But
who's Stacey?
Ralph Stacey. So he was the guy originally picked up by Ken when he wrote the Scrum Guide.
Right. Okay.
And Stacey believes everything's complex, which is just wrong, right? So either way, Cynefin evolved then with the liminal aspects, and then the last resolution last year, which is kind of like completes Cynefin, to be honest. There's some refinements. Was when we realized that the central domain was confused or apparatic. And that was the point where you started. So you didn't start by putting things into domain, you started in the apparatic. And then you moved aspects of things into the different domains. So that was really important. And it got picked up in Agile, ironically, by the XP community. So, I mean, I was in IT most of my life, right? I was one of the founders of the DSDM consortium, and then moved sideways from that and was working in counterterrorism and other areas, always working with technology, but not in the Agile movement. Cynefin is actually about the same age as Agile. It started at the same time. And the XP community in London invited me in, and I still think Agile would have been better if it had been built on XP, not Scrum. But it wouldn't have scaled with XP. I mean, without Scrum, it would never have scaled. It's a compromise. And then it got picked up. And I think one of the reasons it got picked up over Stacey is it said order is possible. It didn't say everything is complex. And virtually every Agile method I know of value actually focuses on making complex complicated.
Yes.
And that's its power. What there's insufficient of, and this is where we've been working, is what I call pre-Scrum techniques. Techniques which define what should go into that process. Right? Because all of the Agile methods still tend to be a very strong manufacturing metaphor and manufacturing ideas. So they assume somebody will tell them what they have to produce. And that actually is a bad way of thinking about IT. The technology needs to co-evolve. And users can't articulate what they want because they don't know what technology can do.
True. But are you saying, because in Agile fundamentally it's really about making sure there's alignment as well, that people are working on the right thing per time, but you're not telling them how to do it?
Well, yes and no, all right. I mean, it depends what you're doing. I mean, some Agile processes, yes, right? But if you go through the sort of safe brain reaming process, there's very little variety allowed within it, right? And self-organization happens within the context of a user, executive, and retrospectives, right? So that's its power. But if you look at it, it took a really good technique called time boxing, and it reduced it to a 2-week sprint. Now that's one aspect of time boxing. I mean, I'm got a whole series of blog posts next week on this, because time boxing is a hugely valuable technique. It says there's a minimal deliverable project, a maximum deliverable product, and a minimal level of resource and a maximum level of resource, and the team commit to deliver on the date. So
to a quality standard.
Yeah. So basically, you know that the worst case is you'll get the minimum product at the maximum cost, but you know you'll get it on that date, so you can deal with it, right? And that's another technique we've neglected. We're doing things which force high levels of mutation in requirements over 24 hours before they get put into a Scrum process. Because if you just take what users want, there's been insufficient co-evolution with the technology capability. And so by the time you deliver it, the users will probably realize they should have asked for something different anyway.
So does this tie in with the pre-Scrum techniques you mentioned earlier? So how can you articulate them?
Is to say different methods sit in different places, and that's again my opposition to things like SAFe, to a lesser extent less, and so on. Right? Is they try and put everything into one bloody big flow diagram. Yeah, and that's messy, right? But it's a recipe. It's not a chef. What a chef does is they put different ingredients together in different combinations. So there's modularity of knowledge, but it's not forced into a linear process. So our work, and we just gone open space and our open source on our methods deliberately, right? In terms of the way it works, is I can take Scrum and I can reduce it to its lowest coherent components, like a sprint or a retrospective. I can then combine those components with components for another method. So I can create Scrum as an assembly of components, or I can take those components, combine with other components, and that way you get novelty. So we're then developing components which sit before traditional Scrum. So like, for example, 888, right? This was an old DSDM method. So you run a JAD session and Scrum has forgotten about JAD. JAD is a really, joint application design, is a really good set of techniques. Everybody's forgotten about it. Yeah, you throw users together with coders for 2 days and you force out some prototypes. Yeah, that actually on its own would transform Agile, bringing that back in spades, right? What we did is we do an 8-hour JAD session, say in London, and we pass it on to a team in Mumbai, but we don't tell them what the users asked for. They just get the prototype. And they can do whatever they want with it for 8 hours. And then they hand it over to a team in San Francisco who can do whatever they want with it in 8 hours. Then it comes back. And every time I've run this, the users say, God, I wouldn't have thought of that. Can I please have it? So what you're doing is a limited life cycle. You get the thing roughly defined. Then you allow it to mutate without control. And then you look at the results and decide what you want to do. And that's an example of a pre-Scrum technique. That is a lot more economical than systems and analysts and user executives and storyboards and all those sort of things. Yeah.
Well, I see what you mean, because it seems like the JAD, the joint application design technique, allows for emergent design, and you shift the decision making closer to the people who are at the forefront. And to an extent, my understanding of some Scrum, not some Agile frameworks, that's also what they promote.
Well, they do and they don't, all right? I mean, a lot of them have picked up design thinking. It's quite interesting at the moment. If you look at Agile and you look at design thinking, they're both at the end of their life cycles.
Why do you say that?
Because they're being commodified. The way you know something is coming to the end of its life cycle, when it becomes highly commodified. If you look at what they are doing at the moment, Double Diamond is now a series of courses with certificates. And I mean, Agile started with bloody certificates, which is why it's always been slightly perverse in the way it works. I mean, this idea that you go on a 3-day course, you get a certificate, you read some slides every year and pay some money and get another certificate is fundamentally corrupt. But most of the Agile business is built on it, right? I mean, I've got 3 sets of letters after my name, but they all came from year-long or longer courses certified by university, not from turning up on a course. Yeah, or satisfying a peer group within a very narrow cultural or technical definition of competence. So I think, and you can see that with design thinking. So it's expert ideation, expert ethnography, and it still falls into that way of doing things. Yeah, and you can see it. People are obsessed with running workshops that they facilitate, and that's the problem. I mean, the work we're doing on citizen engagement has no bloody facilitators in it. Because all the evidence is that the people who turn up are culturally biased to represent the facilitators' opinions. And the same is true if you want to look at unarticulated needs. You can't afford to have the systems analysts finding them because they see them from a particular perspective. And this is 101 science, all right? You do not see what you do not expect to see. We know that, all right? So you're not going to see outliers. And so the minute you have an expert doing something, it's really good, where the bounds of the expertise cover all the possibilities, and it's really dangerous. Well, that's not the case.
So could you tell me a bit more about the unfacilitated sessions you mentioned earlier?
It's definitely not sessions. So we're doing a lot of work with trios at the moment.
Okay.
Trios. So defining roles. So for example, one of the things I would do and have done in IT is to put together young, naive, recently graduated programmer with older experienced tester or software architect. So somebody without any
prejudice or preconceived idea.
Yeah. Preferably with a sort of grandparental age group between them as well. I call it the grandparent syndrome. Grandparents say things to their grandchildren they want to tell to their children, and vice versa. So if you maximize the age gap, there's actually freer information for it. because there's no threat in the process. And then we put it together with users trained to talk to IT people. So in about a month's time, I'll publish that as a training course. So training users to talk to IT people is more economical than trying to train IT people to understand users.
To wrap up then, based on what you've said, about Cynefin and, the wonderful ideas behind Cynefin, how can leaders in organizations, in any organization, apply these and in how they make sense of the world and, take decisions?
Well, there's actually a sensible way forward now. So we just published the EU Field Guide on managing complexity.
Okay.
And that is actually, it's a sort of chef's guide. It has 4 stages: assess, adapt, accept, transcend. Within that, it has things you can do. So it's not a list of qualities, it's a list of practical things you should go and do tomorrow. And one of the things we're building at the moment with a lot of partners, because we won't try and control this needs to be open, is an assessment process that people will go through to decide where they are. So that's going to be available next week on our website.
Oh, fantastic.
For initial registration. Other than that, there's a whole body of stuff on how to use Cynefin. And as I say, we just gone open source on the method. So the wiki is open source. Because from my point of view, we're now at the stage where the market is going to expand very quickly. And to be honest, I've always traditionally used Ken Schwaber as an example of this. The reason that Agile scaled around Scrum is he didn't make it an elite activity, which XP was. I mean, I love the XP guys, but they can't communicate with ordinary mortals. Yeah. It takes you about 10 minutes to tune into them, even when you know the field, right? And he made the Scrum Guide open source, and that way it spread, right? And I think that that's something which people just don't get strategically. In early stages, you keep things behind firewalls. When the market's ready to expand, you take the firewalls away fast. Because, I mean, you keep them behind firewalls initially to maintain coherence so they don't get diluted too quickly, or what I call hawks being made into pigeons. Yeah. But the minute the market is starting to expand, that probably means you've defined it. So you release the firewalls. So the ideas spread very quickly and you accept the degree of diversity on it. So that's the reason we put the wiki in place.
Right. So are there any, books that you would recommend for anyone who wants to learn more about what you've talked about so far?
There's a bit of irony on this. You normally produce the theory book, then the field book, but we done it the other way around. So Mary and I are working on 3 to 5 books which will back up the field guide.
Is it Mary Boone?
Mary Boone, I wrote the article with. Right?
Yes.
She knows how to write to American managers, which I don't. Right. Without losing integrity. So that's coming, right? If you go onto the website, I've listed all the books I read. I don't think there are some very, very good books around complexity, but they're deeply specialized or academic. Girara's book is just absolutely brilliant, but it's difficult to understand if you don't have a philosophy degree. And there are some awfully trite books around complexity. Nearly all of the popular books I've seen, I wouldn't recommend. Yeah. Small Groups as Complex Adaptive Systems is probably quite a good one. And that was published about 20 years ago. Yeah, but we got a book list on the website, so I would look at that.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And do you have any ask of the audience, and how can they get to you?
I mean, we've open sourced the wiki, to create, and wikis need critical mass. So I was really pleased. We had 200 people volunteered to help populate it, so we could get all the methods in the field guide done, and they're actively working at that at the moment. All right, I'm on a call with them later. And to be honest, I've done 18-hour days for the last 2 weeks.
Wow.
But 8 hours of each of those days has been talking through the methods with a group of people who are codified. And that's actually given me a lot of energy because it's huge. So get involved. I think it's the best way. You best understand complexity by getting the principles and then practicing it. And the key thing, I'll leave this because this is the key metaphor. I mentioned it a few times. A recipe book user has a recipe and they follow it. And if they don't have the right ingredients and if they don't have the right equipment, they can't operate, or they say it's not true Agile. Yeah. A chef understands the theory of cooking and has got served an apprenticeship. So their fingers know how to do things. And we need a damn sight more chefs, which is the combination of theory and practice. And the word empirical is hugely corrupted in the Agile movement. Basically saying this worked for me, or it worked for me the last 3 times, is the most dangerous way of moving forward.
Because things change, and what worked yesterday might not work.
And you won't be aware of what worked or didn't work, and so on.
And there's some bias in that, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's called inattentional blindness. Yeah, you can't avoid it.
Great. And Dave, where can people find you? Are you on social media?
Social media is Snowden. LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. 2 websites: the Cognitive Edge website, which is where I blog, and there's a new Cynefin Centre website now, which is a not-for-profit arm.
Okay. All these would be in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, Dave. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
That's all we have for now. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, do subscribe at www.agileinnovationleaders.com. That's agileinnovationleaders.com, or your favorite podcast provider. Also share with friends, and do leave a review on iTunes. This would help others find this show. I'd also love to hear from you, so please drop me an email at ola@agileinnovationleaders.com. Take care and God bless.